my name is Dinatali, and I'm going to talk about the ShinyJS package. So ShinyJS is a package that's available on CRAN and on GitHub. And I actually want you guys to maybe try to install it right now. So just install .packages ShinyJS. And if you go to the GitHub page for it, you can either look for it on GitHub, or you can go to bit.ly/ShinyJS, so bit.ly/ShinyJS. If you go there, you will see, so this is the GitHub for ShinyJS. You'll see that at the top of the README, there are two links. One of the links is for the presentation slides, and the other link is for a gist. And this gist is going to have a lot of code chunks that I'm going to be using in this tutorial. So if you want to try to follow along, or if you want to try to maybe try them out later, you can use all the code in this gist. So if you ever want to get in touch with me about ShinyJS or anything else, you can go to my website, dinatali.com, and my info is right there. First, I'll introduce myself really quickly. I am a master's student at the University of British Columbia. I study under supervision of Jenny Bryan, who is also here. My background is in computer science. I have a Bachelor of Computer Science, and I've worked for a few years as a software engineer and a web developer here in the Silicon Valley. So obviously, my experience as a web developer is what kind of made me gravitate towards Shiny. So the ShinyJS package, first of all, how many people here have heard of it? Wow, nice. And how many of you actually used it? Awesome. That feels good. OK, so some of this may be basic for some of you guys. But at the end, I'll get to the more advanced stuff as well for you people. So I like to think of ShinyJS as an extension to Shiny. So it's a package that adds some more functionality to Shiny, and a lot of the functions are focused around trying to enhance the user experience. The name ShinyJS comes from the word JavaScript, so JS stands for JavaScript. And that's because most of the functions underneath are actually implemented in JavaScript. So the reason this package exists is because when I first learned about Shiny about a year and a half ago, there were a lot of stuff that I wanted to do that I just wasn't really able to with native Shiny. Stuff like simple things that sound simple, like hiding an element or disabling an input. So I ended up having to write JavaScript code to do that. And then I had this huge, massive block of JavaScript code that I would copy and paste into every app I ever made. And then I also found out that a lot of people on Stack Overflow were asking questions about how to do these exact same things. So I decided I'll just make a package so it's very easy for everyone to do that. And it was actually just over a year ago, a year and a few days ago, where I was just on my way back from a Shiny meetup in Los Angeles. I was on a plane to Vancouver. And no internet, no distractions on a plane. So I decided this is a good time to sit down and write this package. So if we have time left over, we can all sing happy birthday to ShinyJS at the end. The first thing I want to show you is the color input. I want to start with this because it's kind of separate from the rest of ShinyJS. And it's what you'd expect it to be. It's just an input for selecting colors. So for example, if you have a plot and you want to let people choose the color for the points or anything else, you can use this. And if you see on the top right here, there's a few links. Some of these slides are going to have some links at the top right. If you want to check them out, you can go to the README, to the GitHub page of ShinyJS. And as you know, there's a link to these slides, so you can click on it from there. So I'm actually going to show you how simple it is to use this function. So I have a snippet in my RStudio to create Shiny apps templates really easily. You can do the same. It's actually kind of handy. So just to show you the color inputs, you give it an ID like anything else in Shiny, a label, and then a value, let's say blue. And then we have a little color picker. And it's very customizable. There's a lot of other stuff you can do with it, but I'm not going to go into detail about it. So getting into the core of ShinyJS, the first thing you have to know about ShinyJS is that you always need to include a call to use ShinyJS somewhere in your UI. I usually like to include it near the top because just for stylistic reasons to know that you're using ShinyJS in this app, but it can go anywhere in the UI of the app. This right here is the simplest code you could use to do something with ShinyJS. So this code chunk is actually available on the gist that I gave you guys. I think it is the second one. I think it's called 02_basic or something like that. So you can copy that into your RStudio and try to run it yourself to make sure that it works. But just to show you how easy it is, I'm going to live code it, and hopefully nothing goes wrong. So yeah, Joe told me that it's very dangerous to do this, but I'm brave enough, I think. So if you actually copy it into your RStudio from the gist, this is what you'll see. There's an action button, and we'll just give it the text of hide. and there is a text input. So we'll just give it the ID of text. Now what we want to do is whenever the button is pressed, we want to observe the event of a click on the button. We'll call the function hide with the parameter text. So what this is going to do is it's going to call the hide function in ShinyJS, and it'll call it on the text input. So if we run that, click on hide, the text gets hidden. And of course, this doesn't seem very useful right now, but you can imagine how in more complex apps, a lot of times it's useful to be able to hide something on demand. And of course, you can also do this simple hiding with conditional panels. If you really want to know why, I think sometimes it's used to do it this way. We can talk about it later. I don't have time to go into that right now. And of course, if there's a hide, there's also got to be a show, right? So let's add another button. Let's call it just button 2, which is terrible. This will be a show button. In this case, if we press on button 2, we'll call the show function. So now, click on hide, it gets hidden. Click on show, it gets shown. So most of the ShinyJS functions are meant to be run in the server. And I could just go one by one through all the functions and kind of change the function here and then show you what happens when I run the app. But that's going to be kind of slow. So instead, there is a sandbox app where I can more quickly show you what ShinyJS can do. So here in this input here, I can just type any arbitrary R expression, and then when I run, it'll run it. So I'm going to show you what ShinyJS can do right within here. Here on the bottom, we have a button, and as it says, the ID of that button is btn. So we already know about the hide function. So I can say hide button, and I can say show button. And another function that goes along with hide and show is toggle. And everyone who's already using ShinyJS knows all this, so I'm sorry if this is boring. It's still the beginning. So the toggle function will hide and show it, alternating between hiding and showing. Another thing that toggle can do is you can also give it a condition. So you can give it any R expression, and whenever it evaluates to true, it'll show. If it evaluates to false, it'll hide. So you can imagine that we have some number, let's say n equals 5, and the condition can be something like, if n is bigger than 10, then show it. If n is less than 10 or equal to 10, then hide it. So in this case, n is 5, so it'll be false, so it'll get hidden. And if we make it bigger than 10, it'll get shown. One more thing I want to show you about the toggle function is that you can also have a selector. So for anyone who knows a bit of CSS, if you want to be able to toggle or hide or show more than just one item at a time, not just based on the ID, you can also give it a CSS selector. If you don't know anything about CSS, don't know what this means, don't worry about this. But let's say if, for example, I want to hide or toggle, actually, all these links inside the bullet points. So again, if you know CSS, you'll know that to reach those, you just go li space a. So if I run this, they'll get toggled all of those links. All right, so that's the hide, show, toggle functions. Those are, I think, the most common functions people use in ShinyJS. Some other really useful functions people find are the disable function. So I can call disable on any kind of input. And yeah, you can see the difference, right? It actually looks disabled now, and you can't click it. And this works for any kind of input. A slider input, a select input, a button. It'll just work for all of them. And of course, there's also an enable equivalent. And just like we have show, hide, toggle, we also have enable, disable, and toggle state is what I called it. So again, this will enable, disable. And you can also give this a selector instead of an ID, or you can give it a condition to conditionally enable or disable based on, it can be based on reactive values, which can a lot of times be really useful. There are a few more functions I want to show you that I think are useful. So one of them is the reset function. So what reset does is you give it an ID of an input, and it takes that input and it changes its value back to what it was when the app first started. So in our example, when the app first started, this input box that I'm typing in had the text, I think it had this text, toggle test. So if I run this expression, the ID of this box is expr. So if I run this expression, it'll change its value back to what it was in the beginning. So you can imagine this is useful, for example, if you have a form and you want to let the user click on the reset button to reset a lot of stuff back to what they were in the beginning. Another function you might find useful is the info function. So what this does is it just shows a simple JavaScript pop-up message to the user. So if I run this, you just get a hey message. Now, it might not be the best idea to always do this because some browsers sometimes block these boxes if you know anything about JavaScript. But if you do want to show a user-facing message this way, you can do it with info. And it can also be used to show any other object. Like, it doesn't have to be just a simple text. So you can also show the R version. Right, it's not a function. It's just a variable. So if I say info R version, it'll nicely show the whole object to the user in a pop-up box. One more function I want to show you is the delay function. So sometimes you want to do something in the UI, but you don't want it to happen right away. And I'll show you an example of why you might want to do that in a couple minutes. So the delay function takes two parameters. First is the amount of time you want to wait. So it's in milliseconds. Let's say 1,000 is 1 second. And the second argument is going to be the expression you want to run when those 1,000 milliseconds have passed. So let's say right now this button is disabled. So let's enable this button in 1 second after I click the button. So I click, wait a second, gets enabled. Now, this is not actually the same as sys.sleep. Does anyone know why or have a guess? Exactly, yeah. So sys.sleep blocks, it stops the execution afterwards. This uses a JavaScript delay, so it'll actually just say, OK, when 1 second passes, call me back and run the expression that you want to run. So it can be useful for anything in your Shiny. It doesn't have to be a ShinyJS function, but it was implemented with ShinyJS in mind.
Hey, Dean?
Yeah.
What were you using to show the little error under the expression box?
Oh, like when something happened?
Yeah.
I'm just using, so there's an error div, and I'm just changing the text inside of it, and I have some CSS to make it red, and I'm just calling show and hide on it. Cool. So if there's an error, show error, and then when I click on run, hide error. Cool. Yeah, so it is, I use it in all my apps, the show and hide. It's actually very handy. So these are some of the common functions that people use in ShinyJS. I want to show you two more functions. So all the functions so far have been only used on the server side, but there's also two functions that you can use on the UI side. So one of the function is the hidden function. So what hidden does is, if I wrap anything in a hidden, then when the app starts, you actually won't see it. It'll be hidden by default. And then, of course, you can show it. And there's also an equivalent for the enable and disable buttons. So there's a disabled function that you can put in the UI. And anything under that will be disabled when the app first starts. And you can also put more than just one input in there. So let's just put a slider input. So both of these inputs will be disabled when the app starts. Now, there's also another thing I want to show you about the disable button. About the disable function. Let's remove this disabled. So let's say when I click the button, I'll make it a disable button. Let's say when I click this button, I want to disable both of these inputs, both text and slider. So one way to do it would be to say disable text and disable slider. But another way is you can wrap both of these inputs in a parent. So let's say I can just put them inside a div. And if I give that div an ID, now I can just call disable on the div, on the parent, and everything inside my form will get disabled. So if I click disable, since both of these inputs are inside that div, both of them will get disabled. And the same works for enable, and reset works the same way. So you can reset a lot of inputs with one call if you just call the parent of all those inputs. Or it doesn't have to be the immediate parent, just anything above it in the HTML DOM. Now, there's a lot more functions that you can use in ShinyJS. And if you go to the README, there's going to be an overview of the functions. A lot of them are very self-explanatory, so I encourage you to at least take a look and see if any of them become useful to you. But I'm not going to go through all of them because there's no time for that. But that's how you use ShinyJS, basically. So now I want to show you a slightly more realistic use of ShinyJS. So let's say we want to do this little simple app that just has a name, an age, a checkbox to say that you agree to some terms and conditions, and a submit button. And we want to make it a little more user-friendly. So we want to make sure the submit button is not enabled unless you check the box. And we want to reset the form after people submit it. And we also want to show a little thank you message at the end. So doing these kind of things is very, very easy with ShinyJS. And I'm going to show you, live coding it again. And again, you can go to the gist and just copy the code for this that I have ready for you guys. And it's kind of a backup for myself if I run into errors. So you can try it yourself too in RStudio right now. So I'll start again with a simple, plain Shiny app. And I have the call to use ShinyJS because you always need that. So we had 3 inputs. We had the name, so that would be a text input. Text input, name, I'll just default to myself. We had an age, so we'll make that a numeric input, age. And then we also had the checkbox. So this will be a checkbox input. We'll call it terms, I agree, and it'll start as false. And of course, we need the button to submit. So, button submit. So this takes care of the UI. Now, the first thing we want to do is we want to make sure this button is not enabled unless you agree to the terms. So to do that, there's 2 ways. The first, more naive way, well, you have to put it inside an observe because we're dealing with reactive values. So the first naive way would be to just say if the terms input is true, so if it's checked, then you want to enable button. And otherwise, if it's not checked, you want to disable the button. So this is how people used to use this a lot in the beginning of ShinyJS. And this is exactly the reason why I implemented toggle state, because instead of doing this, you can just have one line. So you can say toggle the state of the button input, and you want to use a condition. So the condition you want to use is whether or not the terms are checked or not. So hopefully this makes sense to you guys. So whenever the terms is checked, it's true. The condition will be true, and the state will be enabled. So by default, it's off, so you can't click the button. If you check it, you can click the button. So that's one thing. Now the next thing we want to do is reset all the inputs after you submit it. So to do that, of course, you have to do an observe event on the button. And you can imagine this is where you process the data, save it, whatever. And then after you do all that, you want to reset it back so that the next person can come along and submit another response. So you could either say reset name, reset age, reset terms. And this will work. But if you remember, instead of doing all that, you can also just wrap all these inputs inside a common parent. So I'll put it inside a div. And I'm sorry if I'm going a little bit fast. You can, as I said, this is all in a gist, so you can copy it and play with it yourself and see that it makes sense. So now that I put the inputs inside a div, I'll just have to give it an ID so I can refer to it. And I can just say reset to that parent. And it'll reset everything inside of it, so all those 3 inputs. So if I agree, I change that, I change this, I submit, everything goes back to normal. The last thing I want to do is, how much time? OK. Last thing I want to do is have a thank you message, as I said. So let's make a thank you message. It'll just say thank you. Let's make it a little bigger, so we'll put it in H3. Now, we don't want this message to show up when the app starts. So because of that, I'll actually put it inside a hidden tag so that it's hidden when the app loads. So when do we want to show it? We want to show it after we click on the button. So right here, after we reset the form, we'll show the thank you message. Now, we also don't want it to just show and then stay there forever. We want to show it and then maybe go away after 2 seconds so that the next person comes along and doesn't just see a thank you message there. So if we want it to go away, we use the hide function, so hide thank you. But we want it to happen after 2 seconds. So we use the delay function with 2,000 milliseconds. Now, I haven't shown this to you yet, so I'm just going to use it right now just to be a little fancy and to show you another thing about hide, show, and toggle. You can also make them animate, so they don't just appear and disappear immediately. They can animate in and out. And if you look at the documentation for it, it'll tell you all these parameters. So you can say animate is true. You can choose the animation type. And you'll see what this does right now. So if I agree, let's change some of the values. I click submit. Everything goes back to normal. You see a thank you message, and after 2 seconds, it faded away. So hopefully you can understand that this kind of stuff can be really useful in a lot of Shiny applications. One common use that I have is submitting forms. That's why I defaulted to this kind of application. And actually, I'd like to show you a real app, a bigger app that I've built that also uses a lot of ShinyJS and has a very similar use case. So I want to show you how nice it can be. So in this app, there's a file input. And by default, you can't click on upload data because we haven't chosen any files yet. So once I do choose some files, once it's ready, the button becomes enabled. You can click it. And then watch what happens when I click the button. Look to the right of it, right here. You'll see a little loading symbol. And then once it finishes uploading the data, the loading symbol will go away. And you'll see a little check mark if there was no error. If there was an error, you'll see an error message. So click that, thinking, check mark, and goes away. So just little things that can make your app, a lot more user-friendly and easier to interact with. And of course, these are all things that you just saw how to implement with ShinyJS with simple function calls. So it's being really slow. You can also use ShinyJS inside interactive R Markdown documents. And in order to do that, all you have to do is the normal use ShinyJS call, and you just have to give it the RMD equals true parameter. And once you do that, you can use it in interactive R Markdown. If you want to try that, there's also there's a code chunk for this in the gist that I gave you guys that is linked from the README. So you can go to that gist. I think it's the 5th one, and it'll show you a whole R Markdown document that uses some ShinyJS inside of it. I also want to talk about a very common mistake that people make. So because use ShinyJS is usually encouraged to be near the top of the UI, a lot of people do this. When they want to use a Shiny dashboard, they use ShinyJS as the first thing inside the dashboard page. Who knows why this doesn't work? Except for RStudio.
Specify where the container where it's going to be inside, and you haven't done that yet. That's not that okay.
Yeah. So I have so the way I say it is because the dashboard page expects a header is the first argument. And this is not a header. This is just the function you have to call. So you still need to follow the regular structure for dashboard pages, a header, a sidebar, a body. And inside the body, you can put the use ShinyJS. And I do want to mention this because a lot of people have this mistake. So also, if you use it inside a navbar layout, you can't just say it's use ShinyJS inside a navbar page. Again, because it expects a title, not a use ShinyJS function. So the way around that is to put your navbar page inside a tag list. And then in the tag list, you can call use ShinyJS. And this was actually, I think Joe gave me this tip. So thanks, Joe. All right, so this is for people who have used the basic ShinyJS and want to see what the more advanced usage is. You can also use ShinyJS to call your own JavaScript functions. And we actually just saw Yihue talk about how you can do this with Shiny using the session $, send custom message, and then you give it a name and some parameters. So this is how a lot of ShinyJS is implemented under the hood. But I think there's also, I implemented another way to try to call JavaScript functions, and I think it's maybe a little bit easier. And the main thing it does is that it lets you call JavaScript functions in a much more familiar way. So it looks like you're calling just a regular R function. I'll show you what that looks like. So in order to call your own JavaScript functions, there's 3 things you have to do. And if you don't know any JavaScript, this might look a little weird to you. But it's really easy to learn. You can just spend a couple hours on a tutorial online, and it's not that complicated. So let's say we want to have this ShinyJS.foo function. So you have to make sure your JavaScript function is named ShinyJS.something. And in this case, that something is foo. And you have to define this JavaScript function either inside a file, so either like a JavaScript file, or you can just define it as text, as plain text in a variable. And then once you do define your functions, it doesn't have to be just one function. It can be a lot of different JavaScript functions. Once you do that, you go to your UI. And after the use ShinyJS call, you do another call for extend ShinyJS. And you pass it either the path to the file that contains all the JavaScript functions or the text itself that has the JavaScript functions in it. And once you do that, once you tell your UI about your JavaScript functions that are named appropriately with ShinyJS.something, then you can call those functions inside your server using the JS environment. So in our example, the function was called foo, or ShinyJS.foo. So to access it in your server, you go JS $foo, and then you can give it the parameters. So this is also an example that you will have in the gist. So you can try to copy that into RStudio and run it to see how you can call your own JavaScript functions. And I'm going to try to do it right now, live again. So, sorry, where's my, OK. So I'm just going to use this JavaScript function that I have on the slide. And all it does is, you give it a parameter, and it just spits out the parameter in a little dialog box. doesn't do much, but just to convey the idea. And I'm too lazy to put it in a file and save the file, so I'm just going to put it inside a variable, so it's just going to be text. So after we define the function, we have to say extend ShinyJS and tell the UI about it. So extend ShinyJS. We don't want to pass it a script, which is the first argument by default. That means that we have a file, but we don't have a file. We just have text. So we use the text argument. Text equals JS code. That's the variable that we have holding the function. And once we do this, in our server, we can just call JS foo and pass it any string. And if we run that, the first thing that happens when the app runs is it says, OK, call the foo function in ShinyJS, which means this JavaScript function. Give it the hey argument. So it just shows up as hey. Now, one of the reasons that we like using ShinyJS is because it also provides, so I'm not going to go into the slides. It also has another function that's really useful on the JavaScript side, which is called shinyjs.getParams. So again, if you go to the gist, the last file in the gist will give you a usage for that. So what that gives you is it gives you the ability to use default parameters in your JavaScript function. It also lets you call your JavaScript functions either with named or unnamed parameters, which is how you really call functions in R usually. So I'll show you what I mean by that. Let's say this foo function has two parameters, and they both have default values. So let's make those parameters name and age like we did before. So name is Dean, age 27. Oops. So now we want to use this function that, that ShinyJS provides. It's shinyjs.getParams. And you pass it the parameters that were passed into the function, which is this params object. And you also pass it the default parameters that you want to be the default parameters. And then you have to use this function to overwrite the parameters that were inputted into the function. This may sound complicated, but if you just look at it for a couple minutes, it's fairly simple. And then once you do this, what happens is that this params object is always going to have a params.name and a params.age values. So you can imagine that you want to print out my name and age. You can say param.name is params.age. And now in our server, if we call foo, we can either just not pass it anything, in which case it'll use the default values. So let's see that. Yeah, it uses the default values of Dean and 27. Or we can pass it, some other name and some other age. I got to stop the app. So now it'll be Ben and 22. Or it's just like an R function, so you can also just skip the first argument and only pass an age. So in this case, it'll still use the default name. I didn't stop the app before. It'll still use the default name, but it'll use the new age. So you can see that this is a lot more R-like. And it might be a little simpler and easier to call JavaScript like this. So there's a lot of really cool use cases for this. And I don't have time to show you any actual cool ways to do that, what you can do with it. But if you go through the slides, or if you look at the README, there's an FAQ section with a lot of frequently asked questions in Shiny that I found. And a lot of them have solutions in JavaScript. And I have a lot of solutions in Stack Overflow that tell people how to do common things like hiding or disabling a tab in a tab set panel. A lot of people ask for that. So I have an implementation for that using ShinyJS. Or how to programmatically hide or show the sidebar in a dashboard page. So I really encourage you to go to the README for ShinyJS and take a look to see if it could be useful to you. That's it. Thank you.